Welcome to this custom-tailored deep dive. We're looking at a really fascinating stack of material today.
Yeah, it's a heavy one for sure.
It really is. So, we are anchoring our conversation today on the comprehensive Wikipedia article detailing the Third Battle of Gaza. And, if you've ever found yourself just staring down a massive, seemingly impossible project,
Oh, we've all been there.
right, or an obstacle in your professional life that just absolutely refuses to budge no matter how much force you apply to it, you are going to want to hear this.
Definitely. The lessons here are incredibly applicable.
Exactly. Because we are exploring how General Edmund Allenby dismantled an allegedly impenetrable fortress. Our mission today is to head back to November 1917 to the grueling desert theater of southern Palestine in World War I.
Where the British Egyptian Expeditionary Force, the EEF, finally broke a brutal stalemate against the Ottoman Empire.
Yes, and we are going to unpack the brilliant, often totally chaotic blend of ancient cavalry tactics, cutting-edge modern technology, and elaborate psychological warfare that ultimately decided this battle.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Sounds good. To really understand the strategic masterpiece that happened in November, we have to look at the absolute nightmare that was the setup.
Right. It was a true nightmare scenario,
Yeah.
both tactically and psychologically. I mean, to give you the proper context, you have to realize that by late 1917, the EEF had already tried to take Gaza twice.
And failed both times.
Miserably. They fought the first and second battles of Gaza in March and April of that same year, and both were bitter, incredibly costly defeats for the British.
The first one is especially agonizing to read about.
It is. In the first battle, they actually had the city practically surrounded, but withdrew due to a catastrophic miscommunication. Just a total failure of command and control.
And then the second one was just brute force. Right.
Exactly. In the second, they launched a frontal assault and were simply slaughtered. So following those two massive losses, a deeply demoralizing stalemate just kind of settled over the region through the scorching, unforgiving summer months.
And Gaza wasn't just a typical city anymore by this point, was it? The Ottoman defenders had spent that entire summer turning it into an absolute meat grinder.
They really had. Under the command of the German general Kress von Kressenstein, the Ottomans completely transformed Gaza into a modern fortress. We are talking about heavy, reinforced entrenchments and extensive deep wire entanglements.
The kind of stuff that just halts an army in its tracks.
Exactly. But most dangerously, they had engineered a cleared slope, what's called a glacis on the southern and southeastern edges of the city.
Meaning there was absolutely zero natural cover for any attacking force.
None. You would have to run up a totally bare incline. And this fortress was manned by a veteran garrison of 8,000 riflemen, supported by 116 artillery guns. And they were dug in deep. They knew the terrain intimately.
So, the EEF is staring at this open slope, covered by 116 guns, knowing full well that a daytime frontal assault is essentially a suicide mission.
Yeah, that was off the table.
Which forces them to get creative. And this is the part I love. Before a single shot of the main battle is even fired, the EEF initiates this master-level deception campaign to totally blind Ottoman intelligence.
The misdirection was on a massive scale.
It really was. When the British finally started secretly moving their troops inland to concentrate for their actual attacks, they left their old camps completely intact at places like Khan Yunis and Rafah.
And they didn't just leave the tents up. They actively maintained the illusion of daily life. They kept campfires burning. They had skeleton crews moving around specifically to trick the German and Ottoman aerial reconnaissance planes flying overhead.
Because they knew they were being watched.
Right. They wanted the Ottoman commanders to look at those aerial photographs and think, excellent, there are still 6 infantry divisions sitting idle right there on the coast in front of Gaza.
It's a massive commitment of resources just to sell a lie. But, visual tricks only go so far on land. What's incredible is how they extended this theater to the coastline to make the Ottomans deeply paranoid about an amphibious assault.
What's fascinating here is the sheer logistical theatricality of their misdirection at sea.
Yes.
The EEF controlled the coastal sea lanes, right? So their intelligence service started actively seeding rumors through local channels about amphibious landings behind Gaza.
Just whispering in the right ears.
Exactly. But to provide proof for these rumors, they actually had naval ships taking visible soundings off the coast, literally measuring the water's depth right in front of the Ottoman observers.
Which is exactly what you do when preparing to bring in large troop landing vessels.
Precisely. They were pantomiming an invasion.
And they culminated this with a massive fake embarkation on November 1st, right before the attack. They used the Egyptian labor corps. These were the logistics and support workers, not even combat troops, and had them visibly boarding motor launches, trawlers, and tugs at a place called Deir Bella.
In broad daylight.
Right into the fading light of evening, yeah. Making it look for all the world like a massive flanking maneuver by sea was officially underway.
It forced the Ottoman defenders to constantly look over their shoulders toward the water. It split their attention and their defensive posture. But as you hinted at earlier, they were also attacking the minds of the defenders directly.
Right, because they didn't just mess with the troop movements, they engaged in literal psychological warfare from the sky.
The airplane drops.
Yes. There's this amazing detail from a letter General Allenby wrote to his wife describing airplanes flying over the Ottoman lines. But instead of dropping bombs, they were dropping packets of cigarettes.
Which the soldiers would obviously pick up.
Of course. And bundled with those cigarettes were printed proclamations from the Sharif of Mecca.
Which is a brilliantly targeted move. I mean, to understand why that matters, you have to know that the Sharif of Mecca wasn't just a political figure. He was the traditional steward of Islam's holiest cities.
His word carried immense weight.
Immense religious and cultural weight. So when he issued proclamations actively encouraging the Arab soldiers within the Ottoman ranks to defect and join the Arab rebellion, it struck a deep nerve.
Because the Ottoman army wasn't a monolith.
Not at all. It was highly diverse, and many Arab conscripts were already feeling highly marginalized by the Turkish command. Allenby noted that this propaganda actually worked. Quite a few soldiers crossed the lines to defect after finding those drops.
When you look at all these elements together, the fake camps, the phantom naval landings, the targeted propaganda drops, it feels like a highly coordinated attack on the enemy commander's sanity.
That is precisely the strategic takeaway here, and it's something highly applicable to modern strategic thinking or leadership today. This wasn't just about fighting a physical battle of attrition. It was about overwhelming the enemy's decision-making process.
Cognitive overload.
Yes. By feeding Kress von Kressenstein and his command staff a constant stream of false data, Allenby engineered that cognitive overload. He forced the Ottomans to expend immense mental energy guessing where the real threat was coming from.
Which means they keep resources in reserve to defend against ghosts.
Exactly. Managing information, and sometimes deliberately manufacturing it, is just as critical a weapon as managing your actual troops.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because once they had the Ottoman forces sufficiently confused, paranoid, and pinned down by these phantoms, the EEF unleashed the real physical hammer.
The bombardment.
Yes. On October 27th, the bombardment of Gaza began. But this wasn't just standard land artillery lobbing shells. It was a massive, coordinated joint operation involving both the British and the French navies pulling up right off the coast to provide offshore fire support.
The hardware they brought to bear was staggering, especially for the Middle Eastern theater. Sitting offshore, you had a naval flotilla that included British destroyers, the cruiser HMS Grafton, and several monitors.
And monitors are pretty unique vessels.
They are. For those unfamiliar, monitors were essentially floating gun platforms, shallow draft vessels, designed specifically for shore bombardment rather than ship-to-ship combat. They were equipped with massive 9.2-inch and 6-inch guns.
This floating artillery, basically.
Pretty much. You also had the HMS Raglan, featuring enormous 14-inch guns, which could hurl a shell weighing over 1,000 pounds. And joining them were French vessels, including the coastal defense ship Raquin.
So you have these floating fortresses firing inland, combined with the land-based heavy artillery, which consisted of 68 medium and heavy guns and howitzers. Over the course of the bombardment leading up to the infantry attack, the EEF fired 15,000 rounds of heavy artillery.
It's just a punishing amount of steel.
The sources point out that this was actually the heaviest bombardment of World War I anywhere outside of the European Western Front.
The sheer logistics of moving 15,000 heavy shells across the Sinai Desert to fire at Gaza is an incredible feat in itself. And the tactical application was relentless. They were engaging in sustained anti-battery bombardments.
Meaning they were targeting the other side's guns.
Exactly. They were specifically using their heavy guns to hunt and destroy the Ottoman artillery positions so they couldn't fire back at the British infantry later.
There's this really visceral detail from the source material that paints such a grim picture of this. The bombardment was so incredibly intense that by the sixth night, the concentration of fire from onshore and offshore guns falling on one specific small area of the Ottoman lines was actually heavier than the bombardment on the first day of the Battle of the Somme.
which is saying something.
It's terrifying. They were just systematically erasing the landscape. They even fired gas shells during these anti-battery missions.
Though the gas shells proved largely ineffective in this specific environment.
Because of the weather.
Yeah, the desert winds and heat dispersed the gas quickly, sometimes just producing a sickly yellow smoke that caused momentary confusion rather than mass casualties. Yet what really stands out here is the incredible resilience of the Ottoman defenders.
They didn't break.
No. Despite this apocalyptic level of firepower raining down on them for days, the Ottoman 7th and 53rd Divisions held the line.
They didn't just cower either. They actively fought back against the warships.
They did. An Ottoman shore battery managed to track the French ship, the Requin, and scored a direct hit on its mess deck, causing 38 casualties. Wow. It's a stark reminder for anyone studying conflict. Even the most overwhelming, mathematically superior technological advantage doesn't instantly break a well-entrenched, determined defending force.
Right. And because that massive bombardment made it blindingly obvious exactly where the British were focusing their fire, any lingering element of tactical surprise on the ground was totally gone.
Completely erased.
And because the Ottoman machine gunners had survived in their deep bunkers, daytime attacks across that open glacis were still considered suicidal. So that forced the EEF into an incredibly dangerous alternative, a massive infantry assault in the pitch black of night. So we shift to the night of November 1st, heading into the early hours of November 2nd.
The British plan was a phased infantry assault. They were targeting a specific series of sand dunes and trench complexes that formed the outer shell of Gaza's defenses. Phase 1 kicked off at 11:00 p.m. with an attack on a prominent sand dune called Umbrella Hill, which overlooked the main objectives.
And this was the Scottish Rifles, right?
Yes, the 17th Battalion of the Scottish Rifles. They were supported by a heavy, sudden 10-minute bombardment, and then they charged the hill. And against the odds, they took it in just 10 minutes.
To keep their direction in the dark, they had actually laid down white tape on the ground beforehand to guide the troops forward.
A very common night tactic.
But reading through the outcome of that assault, you see the devastating paradox of their own successful artillery fire.
It's a classic, tragic World War I problem.
Yeah.
The massive bombardment we just talked about had actually been too effective on Umbrella Hill. It had virtually obliterated the Ottoman trenches.
Which sounds good until you have to occupy them.
Right. Specifically, it destroyed all the resitments, the wooden planks and sandbag retaining walls that keep a trench from caving in on itself. So when the Scottish Rifles captured the hill, they weren't jumping into a fortified trench. They were basically standing in shallow, unstable sand pits.
Just totally exposed.
They had almost zero cover. When the Ottomans inevitably launched their counter-artillery fire onto the hill they had just lost, the Scottish Rifles suffered 103 casualties over the next 24 hours, simply trying to hold a bare sand dune.
The reality on the ground for these soldiers was just sheer chaos. There's an incredible first-hand account in the sources from Lance Corporal R. Loudon. He was a signaller with the Royal Scots who were involved in the Phase 2 attack on the El Arish redoubt a few hours later, around 3 a.m.
Oh, this story is wild.
It is. He recalls sitting there in the dark, the tension so thick you could cut it, just waiting for the whistle to attack. And suddenly, a soldier who had clearly gotten way too much of his pre-battle rum allowance just starts singing at the top of his lungs.
Just belted it out.
Right in the middle of no man's land. A non-commissioned officer had to sprint over and physically haul the guy away before the Ottomans heard him and opened fire on the whole line.
It adds such a human, gritty dimension to the tactical maps. Loudon describes lying down along that white guiding tape, waiting for the signal, and then plunging into the dark amid intense shell and machine gun fire. His account really brings home the terrifying reality of night combat.
You can't see anything.
You can't. He mentions that the first wave of the Royal Scots advancing on the redoubt hit a field of hidden Ottoman contact mines. The men were blown to pieces, and because of the darkness and the noise, the subsequent waves pushing forward didn't even know what was happening until they were right on top of it.
And as the attacks spread to the coastal defenses in Phase 3, the environment itself became an enemy. The dust kicked up by thousands of artillery explosions, combined with the smoke of battle and the hazy, cloudy night sky, just caused utter confusion.
Complete disorientation.
Whole regiments, like the Norfolk and the Essex, completely lost their direction in the dark. They ended up attacking the wrong trench lines or were forced to withdraw simply because they couldn't coordinate with the units right next to them.
And right in the middle of this chaotic, terrifying trench assault, we see the introduction of a brand new, highly disruptive technology on this front: tanks.
Yes.
The Palestine Tank Detachment was deployed here. But listeners shouldn't picture the sleek, fast armor of modern warfare. They only had 8 tanks available, and mostly they were obsolete Marka models.
Right, these were the early, clunky, diamond-shaped metal boxes originally designed for the mud of Flanders, not the soft, shifting sand and scorching heat of the Middle East. I mean, inside those things, the temperature could easily hit 120 degrees.
And the crew were breathing in exhaust and cordite the whole time.
Miserable.
Very. They were utilized in a very experimental way to support the infantry. They were driven forward to physically roll over the Ottoman wire entanglements and crush them so the infantry could pass.
Which is a great use for them.
It is. In one fascinating case, they didn't just use them as weapons. A tank drove along the front line acting as an armored tractor, literally unrolling new spools of barbed wire behind it to secure a position the British had just captured.
That's brilliant.
But they were incredibly vulnerable. Many of them broke down mechanically in the sand. Others were easily spotted and disabled by concentrated Ottoman artillery fire.
Because they're big, slow targets.
Exactly. In one particularly grim instance, reserve tanks that were brought forward to carry engineering supplies had their payloads of sandbags set on fire by hostile shots.
How does a sandbag catch fire?
Well, early armor was highly prone to drawing sparks from bullet impacts, which could ignite anything flammable strapped to the outside.
Wow. So if we take a breath and look at everything we've covered so far, the massive fake naval landings, the propaganda drops, the heaviest bombardment outside of Europe, the devastating night attacks, the contact mines, the burning tanks, we have to step back and ask the big question. So what does this all mean? Why throw all of this at Gaza? Well, here is the absolute biggest twist of this entire deep dive. This whole brutal, massive, complex assault on Gaza wasn't actually designed to capture Gaza.
That is the pivotal strategic revelation of this entire campaign. General Allenby never intended for this frontal assault to take the city. The Third Battle of Gaza was, at its core, a massive, bloody, highly elaborate pinning maneuver.
It's like holding someone by the collar so they can't move while someone else delivers the knockout punch.
Exactly. Allenby knew that if he wanted to genuinely break the Ottoman lines, he had to do it miles away to the east, at places like Beersheba and Sharia, where the defenses were slightly less concentrated.
But to do that, he needs the Gaza garrison to stay put.
He needed the 8,000 veteran defenders of Gaza to stay exactly where they were. If those 8,000 Ottoman troops had realized the main attack was happening inland and moved to reinforce Beersheba, the whole British offensive would have collapsed.
So he gives them a very loud, very deadly reason to stay.
Yes. He threw this terrifying, overwhelming, multi-day assault at Gaza, purely to lock them in place. He had to make it look and feel like the main event.
And it worked perfectly. The Ottoman forces were thoroughly convinced Gaza was the primary target. They kept their forces there, fighting desperately to hold the ruined trenches.
Doing exactly what Allenby wanted.
Right. But by doing so, they allowed their lines to be shattered inland. By November 5th, the Ottoman artillery at Gaza was exhausted. They only had about 300 shells left.
Which is nothing after days of fighting.
Nothing. When the Ottoman High Command realized their eastern flank had collapsed, they knew Gaza was completely untenable. During the night of November 6th and into the early hours of the 7th, the Ottoman forces skillfully and very quietly evacuated the city.
Which is incredibly difficult to do. Retreating while in active contact with an enemy is one of the hardest military maneuvers to execute without turning it into a total rout.
But they managed it.
They did. They withdrew in good order to form a new defensive line further to the north. But the fact remains, Allenby's massive feint accomplished its strategic goal. The entire Gaza to Beersheba defensive line, which had held strong and frustrated the British since March, was finally broken.
So the sun comes up on November 7th. The British infantry patrols creep forward, expecting machine gun fire, and find Gaza basically deserted and in ruins. The EEF occupies the city. But the deep dive doesn't end there because the fight is absolutely not over. Now begins the pursuit.
And this pursuit is where the contrast between eras of warfare becomes incredibly stark.
It really does.
With the static trench lines broken, the cavalry was finally unleashed. Specifically, the Imperial Service Cavalry Brigade, which included the Hyderabad and Mysore Lancers.
These were traditional mounted cavalry troops armed with lances and swords.
Yes. On the morning of November 7th, they literally rode their horses through the destroyed, smoking ruins of Gaza to chase down the retreating Ottomans. By 1:00 p.m., they had reached a settlement called Beit Hanun, just north of Gaza, where they encountered a heavily armed Ottoman rearguard defending a ridge with numerous machine guns.
And in a scene straight out of the 19th century, the cavalry charged them.
They charged machine guns on horseback.
They fought their way up the ridge from the east and actually captured the position, taking prisoners and capturing artillery pieces. But amidst this dramatic charge, the sources highlight one of those wonderfully quirky logistical details that dictate the reality of desert warfare.
I love this detail.
During this capture, they secured the town's water pumping machinery completely intact. In the middle of the desert, an intact water pump is worth its weight in gold for a thirsty cavalry brigade. But there was a catch,
Right, the pump didn't run on standard liquid fuel. It ran on gas made from charcoal.
which they didn't have.
The cavalry couldn't even use it. They actually had to fall back to a different town entirely just to get water for their horses, while specialist engineers were brought up to completely convert the machinery so it could actually be utilized.
It's a great reminder that an army marches on its logistics.
Absolutely.
And speaking of the clash of eras, while the cavalry is dealing with charcoal water pumps on the ground, the skies above them are painting a very different picture.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the juxtaposition is stunning. Up in the sky, a completely new era of warfare is dawning. The Royal Flying Corps took to the air in force to harass the retreat.
Dropping the cigarettes was over.
Long over. They relentlessly bombed the retreating Ottoman trains, their aerodromes, their transport hubs, and the columns of marching troops. They were dropping bombs and strafing from low altitudes with machine guns. It was the terrifying new reality of combined air and ground warfare, happening simultaneously with a traditional cavalry pursuit.
It really is a mind-bending clash of eras. To wrap this deep dive up, the Third Battle of Gaza is an incredible case study of how a seemingly unbreakable deadlock was finally shattered.
It wasn't just brute force.
No, it was this wild, calculated cocktail of massive naval artillery power, the very first clunky tanks, literal ancient cavalry charges, and master-level psychological deception that overloaded the enemy's ability to respond.
This raises an important question, something for you to think about as you tackle your own complex projects. We've talked a lot about the kinetic action today, the tanks, the ships, the lancers.
The loud stuff.
Right, the loud stuff. But think back to the Egyptian labor corps. These are the logistics and supply workers. Yet Allenby used them to visibly board ships and sell the massive fake naval landing that kept the Ottomans paralyzed.
He used his support staff as a primary weapon.
Exactly.
Yeah.
In modern business, leadership, or strategy, we so often focus entirely on the soldiers, the engineers building the product, or the salespeople closing the deal. But how often do we overlook our logistics, our support structures, and our operational routines, failing to realize that they too can be leveraged as active instruments of strategy, misdirection, and competitive advantage?
That is an incredibly profound thought to leave on, looking at every asset you have, not just the obvious ones, as a tool for strategy. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the source material behind the Third Battle of Gaza. We hope we've given you some fresh perspectives on strategy, cognitive overload, and overcoming immovable obstacles. Until next time, stay curious.